One time when I was a kid, my family and I were on a camping trip around Lake Michigan, Wisconsin. It was beautiful. I remember a ton of things that we did there. And I remember that we camped at almost every state park we came to. But a couple of times I recall that we stayed at a KOA or some kind of sponsored business campground. And one of those had a pool. And so while mom and dad were setting up the tent, my little sister and my little brother ran over to this pool. It wasn't big, but it was deep. And it was one of those no lifeguard on duty things, but I don't know, we all took swimming lessons. It's not going to be a big deal. And so I jump in the water, I'm goofing around, and my brother jumps in the water, and we roughhoused a little bit. And then he swam over to me, and he jammed me under the water. And he's 4 years younger than me at the time, and he couldn't overpower me anywhere else, but in the water, I couldn't find anything to push off of. I didn't have a chance to catch my breath when he did it. And I thought, why are you being a jerk? What's the matter with you, dude? You're going to kill me. And then I figured out he was freaking out. He went into panic mode, and he was trying to use me to climb up out of the water, which of course doesn't work because physics. And I could feel the breath escaping me and a panic setting in myself. And I'm trying to shove him off, and I cannot do it. Swimming was never particularly hard for me, still isn't, but it's really hard when you've got that, not even dead weight, aggressive weight around your neck. And that is probably the second most scared I've ever been in my entire life. I thought I was a goner, and I don't even remember how we got out of it. I have believed for the longest time that somebody bailed us out, but I think I might have punched him or found a way to shock him back into reality. It's getting fuzzy now. But if you've ever had an experience like that where somebody panics on you and they try to push you underwater, you know how freaky that kind of thing is, and therefore you can understand easily how ominous this teaching of Jesus is in Matthew chapter 18. Very charming little passage about how special youngsters are. He flips it around. He's like, oh, and also if anybody messes with them, they might as well tie a millstone, like a great big piece of rock, around their neck and just throw them in the drink, because that is how seriously we take this kind of stuff. And that's the horrifying teaching of Jesus. But also, anytime Jesus takes this tone, it's like when the really gentle neighbor kid's dad, who was always so easygoing and nice and liked having you over at the house, but when he scolded his kids when you were there, you'd be like, I feel like I am the one being scolded, because it's just so weird to see Mr. So-and-so get angry at his kids and, okay, I'm listening, and little ears go down like Simba. This is one of those moments. So here's a passage, Matthew 18:1. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? He called a little child and had him stand among them, and he said, I tell you the truth, unless you change and become like little children, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Again, heartwarming. Then verse 5. And whoever welcomes a little child like this in my name welcomes me. Oh, even more heartwarming. Okay, verse 6. But, if anyone causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a large millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. There that is once again. So we got two ways that we can read the first part of this thing. One is what we kind of explored yesterday, and that's the idea that the disciples here are doing the thing again where they're worried about who gets to sit at the right hand of God and who gets what position of prestige. And it could be argued, as I did yesterday, that this is them not getting it in a pretty grand way, not understanding that the values of this kingdom are upside down and they should get it. You could also take a more gentle view of these guys and say, well, Elijah and Elisha in the Old Testament, there's this expectation that the mentor or the master will pass along the mantle to the mentee or the Padawan. And that is something that was apparently commonplace for other groups of students following after a rabbi, like who's going to get the mantle next? And so Jesus just told them, I'm going to die. Maybe the empathetic view to the disciples here is, well, they want to know where we go from here. Okay, maybe this was their way of saying to him, very well, we're done arguing with you. We're done grieving. We're to the stage of grief that is acceptance. We accept the reality of what you are saying. How's it going to work? Who is going to be in this position of leadership next? Either way, whether we take the empathetic view toward the disciples or the more critical view toward the disciples, Jesus responds the same. He brings his kid over and he's like, look, this is ideal. Now, yesterday, again, we explored the idea that the idealness is in the basic attributes of how a child is, how they respond to a parent, how their brain works, how their development stage works. And when we think of it that way, we got to admit that we are a little bit thinking of children in the post-Charles Dickens era style of thinking about children. I mean, this notion of having a lovely, magical childhood that's safe and protected and innocent up to age 14, and then eventually 16, and then eventually 18, and now like 37. This idea just continues to grow throughout history, that this magic age, these wonder years, are something that kids should have. I happen to be on board with the whole idea of providing children with wonder years. I'm a big fan of that. But that isn't how people thought necessarily in the first century. Kids were considered to be a blessing for sure. They were also considered to be a blessing because they were a retirement plan in an era where Social Security was not a thing. So I think if we go with yesterday's Charles Dickens-esque read on the magical childhood thing, children are treasures thing, that works just fine for all the reasons we talked about yesterday. But it's also possible that the original audience would have thought that kids were completely aware of their total lack of status, very, very bottom rung status. And if that's the case, then that fits pretty neatly with what Jesus is saying about first and last and how all of that works. I think it is probably more likely that this latter read is what the original audience would have thought of. But then Jesus' statement in verse 5 would elevate the status of that child. Whoever welcomes a little child like this in my name welcomes me. Oh, that's a little bit countercultural, much like Jesus was a little bit countercultural on the whole women in society thing. Jesus did not see the social pecking order the way the rest of culture did. But then he likens that child to the person who has the right understanding of their role before the king and the king's role in the whole equation. And the one who gets that, who assumes the posture of a little child and then receives some sort of misleading or abuse or is dragged astray by someone who fancies himself to be much better and much more informed and much more enlightened than that little child, Jesus is issuing a stern warning. There's something really screwed up about a person cutting in on that kid or that spiritual kid who has assumed the right posture before the king. There's something really screwed up about cutting in on that and messing with it because of one's pride or imagined high station. And the warning here, even though it looks to be directed exclusively at the disciples, to me then it sounds like an extension of the sandwiches incident all the way back over in 16. And as they're crossing the lake, Jesus says, be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And the disciples are like, we forgot to bring bread. He's probably mad at us. And Jesus is like, no, I mean like they're teaching and stuff. Just move on from them completely. And they're like, oh, yeah, we totally knew. This looks like a doubling down on that point, as though to say the people who lead others astray, the people who are drawing people away, I'm using Jesus' voice now, away from my kingdom, away from the true king, those people, they stand to be judged harshest of all. How does this translate to people now? Well, first of all, I can say this. It is given to Jesus, according to the Bible, to judge the nations, to judge the soul. He knows what he's doing perfectly. If any of us had that position, we would screw it up disastrously, and that's why it is not given to us to judge. So there is no expectation implicit in this passage to say, you future followers of me, go around and find people who are wrong religiously or who teach dumb things or people who make offensive shows on Netflix or tweet bad ideas that are totally unchristian or vote in wrong ways or are bad teachers at school who teach dangerous ideas and put millstones around their necks and throw them into water in the name of me, Jesus Christ, the Lord of love and grace. It just clearly, if we interpret the less clear in light of the more clear, that is, we interpret this narrow statement from Jesus in light of all the other statements and actions of Jesus, it cannot possibly mean that? When people went to take up the sword on behalf of Jesus, Jesus shut that business down. The teaching here does not mean, so Christians go find bad people who think bad things and make sure to punish them by sending them to an inescapable watery grave. Gross. That's horrifying. Christians should renounce violence based on the teachings of Jesus and the New Testament. Instead, what I think he's saying is there is something very, very precious about this new family of faith that he is creating. There is something very special about the paternal love that he feels toward these sons and daughters in this new family of faith. And there is something absolutely to be rejected and judged by him. And I suppose the invitation, based on what we flip back and read in Matthew chapter 16, is there for his followers as well to evaluate bad ideas and reject those ideas, to say there is something particularly screwed up about that religious leader, about that person who claims to know all the things about God, who cuts in on this one who assumes the right posture before the king and messes with that stuff. Scary? Yep, it's scary every time Jesus talks about these things. And that particular imagery is awfully scary as well. This is just the tip of the iceberg on this thought from Jesus, and I'll explain more about what seems to be going on here and what that means mañana. Everyone who is participating in the Jeff Foot musical outro music Easter egg challenge, I'm super excited to get your emails and messages. I've got a bunch of those already. Some people have turned in some pretty impressive results. Nice job. The game is, for those of you who don't know, to go back, listen to the outro music in different episodes, and try to figure out what it means. Why is it an Easter egg? What's the connection? Why did we do that thing musically? Or why did Jeff do that thing musically? I'm going to give it a few days to allow all of these answers to come in. When you have your answer ready, you can present it however you want in the form of an email. You can send it to tmbh@gmail.com, and that's how you can get a hold of the podcast in general. I'm looking forward to reading those and to awarding some ludicrously awesome prizes. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'm Matt. This is the 10 Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.